MedBix Webcast is a new kind of healthcare media channel to break the silo mentality and foster interdisciplinary thinking. Our mission is to fill that gap and to create a curiosity through different lenses, tapping the passion that guided the historical figures in medicine and bringing present-day groundbreaking research to the front lines. We interview physicians and leaders in the industry about present-day healthcare challenges on our live programming. That human aspect of it will allow to to invent. It helps you innovation. That is my goal. So this broadcast is really taking off. Thank you, Dr. Leah Houston gave me an excellent compliment. She's an awesome program. She participated in my one of my broadcasts. As you know, I have an accent. Still, the content is more powerful. So I hope so. So anyway, this is I'm going to introduce you the guest. She is out of the charts, her educational background. They can tell you she's a physician, astronaut, aquanaut, scientist. I don't even know what aquanaut is. We'll ask her what she does in aquanaut. She's a taekwondo champion. Don't mess with her. And she does space medicine. Then there is why I think it is just a wilderness medicine. I never heard that. These are the extreme medicines. Extreme climates. How do the medicine work? I think we definitely is very interesting. I'm a physicist. I have a physics background. I have a master's in physics and master's in nuclear engineering. I did a nuclear engineering and computer science, but never that kind of. I spent 30 years in healthcare, but also I grew up in Canada, and then let me bring her to the table. Welcome. This is let me bring Dr. Pandya to the stage. Okay, welcome, Dr. Shawna Pandya. I wanted to ask you.
Yes.
Born in a tundra, ice tundra, how a brown girl became a space explorer. That is very interesting.
Yeah, you're right. It's very cold here right now. I think the low today was minus 27 degrees Celsius, which is also very cold in Fahrenheit. You're asking about my origin story. So I'm a scientist astronaut candidate with the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences. I haven't been to space yet, but I hope to someday. And like so many other kids out there, it started with a dream. As a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut growing up, and I just never grew out of that dream. And I was lucky enough to be growing up in the 90s when Canada's first ever female astronaut, Dr. Roberta Bondar, flew to space. And so I said, okay, well, she's Canadian, I'm Canadian, she's a woman, I'm a woman. So now all I need to do is go be a neuroscientist, physician, and astronaut, and that will be my path. And so that's what spurred me to study neuroscience. I did my master's in space studies at the International Space University. And that's when I really realized for the first time that you could actually make space medicine part of your career, and we can talk about what that field is later this hour. And then from then I went on to complete my medical degree and never really lost that appetite for human spaceflight. I had some amazing opportunities along the way. I was lucky enough to intern at the European Astronaut Center through the European Space Agency as part of my master's internship. I worked with their crew medical support office, and later on I interned at the NASA Johnson Space Center through an aerospace medical elective. So that space bug was there the whole time. There were lots of adventures, and it started off with being a kid, and it started off doing lots of outdoorsy things, going camping and seeing these amazing night skies and thinking, I want to be out there.
Shawna, your credentials are just out of the charts for us, even for your intellectual. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about the space is you worked on a project called Possum. It's a very interesting. I want to tell you, mesosphere is mesosphere is as close as you can get in the Alberta. I went to school in Alberta.
Oh, you did.
I went to school in University of Edmonton for a short period of time. I experienced it was cold. I don't want to do that anymore. But
pretty cold.
Explain to me your science about the mesosphere is as cold as probably Alberta. Tell me about that mesosphere.
Yeah, so that's actually the origin story of how this whole scientist astronaut candidate moniker came up. And so, how I got involved with the being a citizen scientist astronaut candidate is. I started off training in neurosurgery before I ended up in rural emergency medicine. And when I was transferring into general practice, I had put on my space dreams on hold for a very long time. And I thought the first thing I want to get back to now that I have time again is space. And so I saw one of my colleagues had joined this program called POSSUM. And what you'll quickly learn is that everything in the space world and the exploration world is an acronym. So POSSUM stands for Polar Suborbital Science of the Upper Mesosphere. And the whole idea of this program is that they would send citizen scientists up to the upper levels of the mesosphere, 50 to 83 kilometers above the Earth's surface, to get more information and data about these things called noctilucent clouds. And so they're this relatively new type of cloud on the meteorological phenomenon. They've only been described since the mid to late 1800s. And they're thought to be a marker of climate change because they become more prevalent and are occurring at lower latitudes other than polar regions. And so we're seeing more and more of this new type of cloud, this noctilucent cloud, also known as a polar mesospheric cloud. So we need more data. And so with POSSUM, the idea was we would send these scientists up in suborbital flight to get more visual data, more atmospheric samples, to analyze the composition of these clouds and see what exactly is the relationship to climate change and how will this inform our knowledge of upper mesospheric changes secondary to global climate change.
So there is a relationship between these clouds, the strange clouds that you're saying, that those are all and the climate change. That's interesting that you study about those clouds. Is that, if I'm understanding?
Yeah, it's like a canary in the coal mine because it's one of the first indications that there's, or not one of the first indications, but it is an indication that climate change is progressing. And examples we've seen of that is that typically these polar mesospheric or noctilucent clouds, they happen in polar regions, hence the name, and they happen at certain times of the year. And what we're seeing now is that they're actually coming down from the poles and coming down to lower latitudes, and they're happening for longer periods during the year. So they're becoming more prevalent. And the link between climate change and noctilucent clouds is that the thinking is that with increased water vapors being trapped in the atmosphere, this creates a layer of ice crystals that seed the upper mesosphere, and those upper mesospheric ice crystals form the basis for the seeding and the formation of a noctilucent cloud. So it's not your typical greenhouse gas. It's actually water, increased water emissions as a byproduct of increased greenhouse gases that forms the basis of a noctilucent cloud.
Interesting. Now you went to space and you were studying about space. Now let us go to the Aquanaut, the marine side of that thing. You went from all the way to the top to the bottom. Tell me about that Aquanaut. What is your experience about that, and what do you find? What kind of things you find in that Aquanaut training?
Yeah, so when we talk about an aquanaut, we talk about someone who has lived and worked underwater, and they've breathe the same higher pressure air that exists underwater. So it's the technical definition is someone who's breathed the same ambient air pressure as the surrounding water around them and who's been in that environment for more than 24 hours. And so that's the technical definition, but the layman's answer is that it's someone who lives and works underwater. And the relation to space is when we talk about how that type of environment prepares us for this high-risk, austere, isolated, remote environment up in space. We actually have this saying in the exploration world, same, but different. And so when we talk about being an aquanaut, we refer to that environment as being an analog environment because it's analogous to the space flight environment. It's remote, it's isolated, it's resource limited. So there are some parallels there. And so when we say same but different, it reflects certain aspects of the space flight environment. So I went down in 2019 with a crew of 5. We lived and worked underwater for 5 days. We were 2 Canadians, 3 Americans, and we performed all sorts of science related to physiology, psychology, and also tested brand new technologies, which includes my work with Luxsonic, which was my first encounter with the company, and the rest, I guess, I say, is history.
Very interesting. These are all different kind of medicines you're talking about. These are different fields. Even a lot of physicians may not know even. There's a wilderness medicine. What is that? Wilderness medicine is?
Wilderness medicine is the branch of medicine that looks at how do you treat injuries when you're away from your creature comforts and the typical medical facilities you may expect to have. And so it pares down medicine into looking at, yes, you can assess, you can diagnose, and you can treat, but you're very resource limited. So how are you in turn going to be creative and resourceful to be able to treat a patient? So there's entire fellowships dedicated to this. There's entire conferences and societies dedicated to this. And it's, it can be, wilderness medicine comprises everything from, breaking a leg while on a hike in the forest and using a tree branch to make a splint, to being creative and using your clothes and the materials you have at your disposal to make a Band-Aid or figure out a way to make a stretcher to carry someone out of a difficult situation. But the whole philosophy is not every arena is going to have the full capacity of a tertiary level hospital, but medicine happens wherever people go. And so, one of the organizations I'm involved with says wherever humans go, medicine must follow. And that's basically the philosophy in a nutshell.
Shawna, if you go to the mesosphere, is there any relationship, anything space medicine you do on a zero gravity, microgravities, or is there anything that you do also some studies in that mesosphere or in polar region about the medicines related to medicine?
Yeah. So for those who don't know, when we talk about space medicine, what that entails, so often I get asked, like, how are space and medicine? How are those like terms? And my short answer is that space is trying to kill you because the space environment is quite hostile. When we talk about the challenges of being in space, we just talked about what it means to be resource limited and confined, whether you're an aquanaut or whether you're practicing wilderness medicine. But you're also in the zero G or microgravity environment. So if you're in that environment for a long time, every single bodily system is affected. Your bones lose density, your muscles lose mass, your fluids shift upward, your inner ear gets confused. There's increased radiation. The further out you go, by the time you're out at Mars, there's a 2-second communication delay round trip. If you're in Mars, there's a 46 round trip communication delay when the two planets are aligned the furthest. So there's all these considerations in the spaceflight environment. So even when you think of something as short as a suborbital flight, which is 3 minutes of microgravity, we can start collecting answers even during that short flight. And so we've even seen during parabolic flight where we don't necessarily go to space, but we fly zero G. There's all sorts of studies that, and answers we need about how does the human body react? How does the inner ear react? What changes do we see happening in the cardiovascular system? What happens to vital signs and heart rate variability as we transition in and out of zero G and hypergravity. So regardless of the duration of microgravity, even in the 3-minute period of a suborbital flight, there's a lot of science and a lot of space medicine research to be done.
And also, you will find a suborbital space or mesosphere or above that. The medicine that you do also, it accelerate the discovery of drugs, right? Pharmaceutical drugs, you can find it. I did a just small program on space medicine, a lot of protein growths and all those things. So explain a little bit, if I explain to our audience a little bit.
There's this rising interest. Yeah, that's a really great question. That there's this rising interest in leveraging the microgravity environment to say how can this help us, and that includes for manufacturing. There's interest in using the micro-G environment for semiconductors, for fiber optic cables, and also for drug development. And so when we come back to these crystals that you were talking about, in the 1G environment, crystals don't grow evenly because they have that 1G gradient in force, whereas crystals in the 0G environment can grow larger and more spherically than they would on Earth. So there's thought to be advantages to being able to manufacture in 0G.
So, when you go to the space, it's a microgravity, but when you go under the water, it's a basically enormous pressure, right? Is that the pressure so what are the things you come out of the pressure medicine in that? What are the things that in the diagnosis or treatment or discovery of medicines? What do you think in
That's a great question. So the further down you go, the deeper you go, the more pressure there is to contend with. So for our Neptune mission, we were at the Jules Undersea Lodge, which was 20 feet of water. So it's actually not all that deep. And for most purposes, the pressure isn't considered to have a huge effect. That being said, we still noticed in very little subtle things, like the food that we brought down with us, little chip packages, they would scrunch down at 20 feet. The foam in our shoes would squish down at 20 feet. Physiologically, we noticed differences even at that depth. And then where NASA sends its astronauts to become aquanauts is called NEMO, or NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations. And that underwater research facility is called, it takes place at the Aquarius Reef Base, just down the road from the Jules Undersea Lodge. So both are at the Florida Keys. They're only 13 miles apart. But Aquarius Reef Base is 60 feet underwater. So there's a lot more pressure all of a sudden. And so physiological effects that we studied during our mission included cognition and processing time, performance, concentration. We looked at stress levels. We looked at psychological resilience and well-being. So there's regardless of the depth, there's always lots of science to be uncovered, and the deeper down you go, there's more considerations. And so anyone who's a diver out there will know that once you're at depth for a certain period of time, you need to ascend slowly. Otherwise you risk a dive injury, because the bubbles that are in solution in your bloodstream will come out too quickly and cause emboli and lodge in bad places like your brain or your lungs, and it can, in the worst case scenario, cause seizure, coma, or even death. And so when you're at depth as an aquanaut, if you don't ascend at a set rate, you're putting your life at risk. So when you talk about decompression periods, at the Jules Undersea Lodge at 20 feet, there was no set decompression period because it was close enough to surface pressure. When you're down at the Aquarius Reef Base, you actually have to wait 16 hours and 47 minutes before you can surface safely. And so when you compare that to the International Space Station, suddenly it makes sense why you would use that place as an analog for preparing astronauts for space. Because if you have an emergency on the space station and you command an evacuation and escape in a Soyuz space capsule down to definitive medical care on Earth, it can be as little as 3 to 6.5 hours. So compare that, 6.5 hours from space to nearly 17 hours from 60 feet underwater. So that's the value of an environment like the Aquarius Reef Base for preparing astronauts for space.
So, now we talked about physical stresses of in space and the underwater, and what about the psychological pressures they feel? Can you explain that a little bit? People don't understand what psychological pressures they have in space. And there was a movie, Brad Pitt did that one movie actually, under the sea, under the water. What are the psychological pressures they face, and what are the cognitive situations there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a really important one because when we talk about the big five challenges of human spaceflight and long duration spaceflight, we call it the RIDGE framework. We talk about radiation, isolation, and confinement, which is what you're talking about, and then things we've mentioned already. So distance from Earth, altered gravity, and everything else, which includes exposure to lunar dust. So coming back to your question about the psychological challenges of the spaceflight environment, these are numerous, and so this includes everything from being in this closed, confined space for months at a time. So you're away from your family, your loved ones. If you want to go outside and get a Starbucks, you can't do that. You have to be a good teammate. You have to be one who works well with your team, but also works productively on your own. You don't want to be that guy or girl who's voted off the space station. You have to be able to deal with a very operationally heavy schedule. So on the International Space Station, the operational schedule is scheduled down to the 5-minute mark. So that's how rigorous things are. You need to know a multitude and be able to perform well across a series of domains, whether that's science, whether that's engineering, whether that's operating a robotic arm, whether that's being able to perform a spacewalk, whether that's being able to communicate your science and do outreach with schools. You have to be a master of your trade, but also a jack of all trades. And then the other thing that we don't think about is the day-night cycles and sleep, and how that contributes. So it's loud on station. So there's always distractions. There's mission control to respond to as well. And then when we talk about how the day-night cycles flip up on station, the International Space Station completes an orbit every 90 minutes. So every 90 minutes, there's a sunrise-sunset cycle. So 16 sunrises and sunsets per 24-hour period. So you can imagine that really must interfere with one's sleep cycle. And it depends on where you're going. So if you're going to the moon's equator, the lunar day consists of 14 days of day and 14 days of night. So there's all of these little things that keep piling up to potentially adversely affect one's psychological health, and that's why it's prioritized as a key area for long duration spaceflight.
You're truly an inspiration for everyone, particularly young women. But I'm going to ask you about the venture that virtual reality. I will be, after I present my topic, and I'll be talking about that your venture about the virtual radiology. I've been involved in the radiology for a long time. I used to own an imaging center in Atlanta, and I did a radiology side quite a bit extensively. I participated. I will ask you, then I saw that little bit of video of that. It is an amazing. And I wanted to ask you once I get back on bring a little bit of different fields and then interdisciplinary field to the medicine. So you do that all the times. One of the things you are doing that is, you are involved with, or what do you call, a virtual reality radiology training program. Tell me about that, a little bit about it.
Yeah, so this was the technology that I mentioned when I was talking about some of the technologies we tested on our underwater Aquanaut mission. One of the things we brought down with us was this virtual reality headset. And the reason was it housed this medical technology, the world's first virtual reality radiology reading room. And I, as the crew medical officer, definitely had an interest in medical technologies for austere environments, as we've been talking about this hour. And so the benefits, why do that? What does that even mean? So just to back up a step, when radiologists read images, whether it's an X-ray, a CAT scan, an MRI, it's really a fine-tuned process. They need a very delicate setup of high-resolution monitors. They need their dictation software. They need a secure cloud server on which to be able to store the images. So this physical setup actually takes tens of thousands of dollars. It takes a lot of physical space. As you can imagine, not everywhere has the infrastructure to house that level of radiology setup. And so definitely on our underwater mission, we didn't have the space to set up a radiology reading room. But it's not just underwater. Across the world, there's so many medical, rural, remote cities, villages that need access to health diagnostic imaging. And so the CEO of the company, my boss and a good friend, said, "Well, what if we could leverage the power of immersive technology, specifically virtual reality, to recreate that workflow in virtual reality. So then if you're a radiologist, you can read images, you can deliver that critical piece of healthcare to patients, regardless of where you are, how little space you have." And so thus was born the company Luxsonic and this product Sievert. And so basically you put on the headset and suddenly you have access to your full slate of tools that you would as a radiologist. So to give you an example, when I was underwater on this mission, I took the headset with me and we did a simulation where we had a trauma and we'd imaged the patient. And so we had this comminuted scapular fracture of the simulated trauma patient. And I was able to meet up in this virtual reading room with the head of radiology in Canada in Saskatoon, over 4,600 kilometers away, to review this imaging and the key findings. And so imagine, you don't have to be underwater to appreciate how useful this is. I work a lot of rural emergency as well. And so I'm often in need of a specialist to say, hey, can you review the key findings with me? This broken forearm, does it need to be reset? Is it too displaced, too angulated? So you can recreate all of that critical workflow, collaboration, expert consultation in this virtual space. So that's the origin story with Luxsonic, and that's what we aim to do. And we've also developed a virtual reality training and certification platform for medical and healthcare professionals to train and practice critical procedures and skills in virtual reality. And then the space connection there is we've built modules for the Canadian Space Agency to be able to practice skills in virtual reality, so they don't have to bring all of their hardware, all of their setup, all of their tools to practice skills, so they can still keep up their skills on a long duration space flight, even when they may not have all of the typical physical architecture they would need.
Truly amazing. I've been involved with the radiology for a long time. I'm not a doctor, but I've been in with radiology equipment. I ran the imaging center. But I tell you, so you're saying to me, you can diagnose actually on this virtual reality set, you can actually diagnose it.
Exactly, yeah. So with most commercial headsets, the resolution of images for your day-to-day X-rays and CTs is good enough to, when compared to the traditional physical setup, to be able to read with the same resolution and accuracy. We've run several trials with our academic partners. Mammography is the one exception to that. That tends to need higher resolution and need some higher end headsets. But for day-to-day X-rays, your commercial off-the-shelf Oculus or HTC or your Vario headset, whatever you have, it will support medical and diagnostic care.
Tell me the process between once you've taken the image from MRI or CT scan or just a plain X-ray, how do you move that into the virtual reality? What is the transformation process involved?
Yeah, so for the technical details, I would have to refer you to our CTO. Yeah, but we do replicate the spot. Yeah, we do replicate the secure PAC server and the secure cloud storage that you would have in a traditional radiology workflow.
I didn't know that. It's truly amazing. You can diagnose, so you can empower a lot of radiologists from small towns, rural areas. I went to Regina, even in Canada. I've been to Regina, Saskatchewan, Saskatoon. Even small towns like in my hometown in India village, my father used to practice. So you can empower them with this virtual reality set. They can literally see the radiology images from there. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. We can bring diagnostic imaging to anyone, anywhere, anytime, as long as they have a headset, and we bring the back-end infrastructure with us.
Very good. I wanted to, so thank you. That is an amazing venture, and I love to be, help and involved anyway. You guys like it, but it is a truly an inspire. That is a totally mind blowing in my view. But I wanted to ask you. The question is that you're doing. What is the next steps on the think? What are the new frontiers in the space medicine or marine medicine or wilderness
Yeah.
medicine?
Yeah.
What do you think? What are the new things,
Yeah.
new frontiers?
There's two major horizons in space medicine, and so there's the near term and then the very far term. They're actually almost at opposite ends of the spectrum. So one is the rise of commercial space. So we talked earlier this hour about suborbital flight, and so we're seeing what we mean by commercial space is suddenly it's not just NASA astronauts who get to go to space, and so the difference is NASA astronauts are very, very highly selected for health, for physiology, for psychology. They're the best of the best. And so when we open up the frontier so that anyone who wants to go be a spaceflight participant, go be a space tourist, anyone who wants can go by a ride to space, suddenly we have a change in the health profile of who's going to space. So as we open up frontiers to access to space through Blue Origin, through Virgin Galactic, through a whole host of emerging space companies, now we have to say, well, when we're not sending the healthiest of the healthy to space, how does that? How does the challenges of the spaceflight environment that we talked about this hour? How does that impact the everyday physique and physiology? So that's the one end of the horizon of what's next in space medicine, and then the other is the far off destinations. And so when coming back to space agencies, the international community, NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, ESA, the JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, have their sights set on long duration spaceflight and exploration class missions. So NASA has very firmly said that we're going back to the moon and we're going back to stay. So that means it's an international undertaking. It's a very, very challenging undertaking. So there's a lot of international cooperation required. So coming back to what's on the horizon in space medicine, when we look to far off destinations like the moon, it's realizing that we can't evacuate back to Earth if we have a major medical issue. The moon is 2 to 5 days away. One of the goals towards going to the moon is using it as a test bed for Mars, which is 6 to 9 months away. So now imagine you have a critical medical event on Mars. How do you empower your astronaut crew to be able to be autonomous and treat critical medical issues in situ? So along with that comes emerging technologies like virtual reality and immersive, like we talked about, for skills maintenance, 3D printing to acquire tools that you may need, AI and machine learning to help support diagnostics. So there's so many emerging technologies that will need to help empower us to not just survive, but thrive on the moon and Mars. So when I say there's two horizons for space medicine, it's commercial space and exploration class missions.
Can you shed some light on the spacesuits? What is it about spacesuits? What are the commercialization of the spacesuit? Because a lot of people are going to go to the space now with the Virgin Galactic and the Blue, all those things. So what are the things involved with the commercializing the spacesuit, and how do you monitor the quality and all those things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you had a nice image of that EVA extravehicular activity spacesuit up on that on the possum slide. Yeah. And so when I say in space and exploration, everything's an acronym. So when we talk about spacesuits, we talk about EVA and IVA spacesuits, and the difference is EVA is extravehicular activity spacesuit, so outside your spacecraft, and IVA is inside, intravehicular activity spacesuit. And so the reason we need it's pretty intuitive as to why you need a spacesuit outside of the space capsule. You need to protect it from the extremes of the temperature, the vacuum, the radiation, debris. So it's obvious as to why you need an EVA spacesuit. Yeah, that's the one. And then inside your spacecraft, especially on launch and landing for orbital missions, you wear an IVA or intravehicular activity spacesuit. And the reason is in case that there's an atmospheric compromise in your spacecraft or launch vehicle, you have a secondary mini spacecraft in the form of your IVA spacesuit, which you can put the visor down, pressurize, and have a habitable life support system within that suit. So to your question about how does that impact suborbital flight and Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, these commercial companies are very committed to making spaceflight safe, comfortable. They want it to be more like commercial air travel. So we don't need any layer of protection when we fly on a transatlantic flight from New York to London, say. And so that's the same kind of environment that's been recreated in suborbital vehicles. They say it's so safe your grandmother could fly. We call that a shirt sleeve environment. And in fact, even NASA astronauts, the astronauts on the space station, once they have completed their docking maneuvers with the space station, they're not always wearing their spacesuit inside the space station. If you look at videos of astronauts on station, they're in comfortable clothes, they're in shorts, they're in t-shirts, they're in pants. So it's really more for the critical moments when there may be a loss of atmosphere or pressure in the launch vehicle. So to get into the last part of your question, you talked about commercial spacesuits, which is right up my alley, because that's one thing that we've been very privileged to do through Project Possum and the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences. We worked with Final Frontier Design to test both their EVA and IVA spacesuits. We've tested them in zero-G, we've tested them in water scenarios. And this comes back to your question of how do you trust your spacesuit? How do you know it's safe? And the answer is, before you can send anything to space, you have to test, and then test some more. And before something can be deemed truly space ready, it actually goes through a series of TRLs. So there's another acronym. TRL means Technology Readiness Level. So for space technologies, this exists on a scale of 1 to 9. 1 might be something that you just, an idea that you just scribbled on the back of a napkin in a bar, so it's concept phase. And 9 is something that has spaceflight heritage and is you can trust to operate in space. And somewhere along the way, technology level 6 to 7 is something that you've tested in a space-like environment, like the parabolic flight. And so way before a technology like a spacesuit makes it to space, it's been tested in all sorts of space and space-like environments to make sure you can trust the engineering of the spacesuit.
What kind of material they use for the spacesuit in general?
Yeah, it depends on the layer of the spacesuit you're talking about. So all of these, the anatomy of a spacesuit is fascinating. So you have outside layers that may be cloth. And in the case of the EVA spacesuit, you have increased radiation protection, for example, on the visor. On the insides of these spacesuits, you may have these coils of liquid tubing to help cool the tube. You may have various new materials and plastics on the inside to be waterproof, to be able to seal against the environment. So it's actually a multitude of materials that's used. It depends on the layer of the suit that you're talking about.
These kind of technologies are useful. People think it only applies in the space or some under the water. But I found out recently that in NASA they gave a spin-off for menopause. For a menopause woman, they can use the gloves technology for the variation of the temperatures in their menopause, going through menopause.
Yeah, there's all sorts of examples of spin-in and spin-off technologies. And so when we say spin-off, we mean technologies that have been used for spaceflight, that have been used to make life better on Earth. And there's lots of examples of medical technologies that have benefited from spaceflight. So to your point, something similar, the sensors and the sensor suits that were used to monitor astronauts during the shuttle days has been spun off into something called Mama Goose pajamas that have been used to monitor infants at risk of sudden infant death syndrome. So we use space-based technologies to keep babies safe.
I'm so proud of you as an fellow Indian, and you're truly an inspiration to all young women in the world. I think it's an honor and a privilege to talk with you. I can talk with you hours together. Thank you so much, Shawna, Dr. Pandya.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Thank you all.
We are retelling their stories through our patented designs that can be worn on scrubs, t-shirts, printed on conference bags, and endless other promotional materials. Daily Wear for Medicine is the first ever of its kind to create curiosity in medicine through visual art. We at MedBricks are celebrating unsung heroes of the past who made enormous contributions to the field of medicine through our unique campaign called Daily Wear for Medicine. You can wear it, carry it, and give it.